Welcome to DIY Easy Crafts and Berg Knifemaking.com. Today we're going to take a look at how this knife was made. This particular blade is AEBL stainless steel. It's got stainless steel bolsters, stainless steel pins, and water buffalo scales, or water buffalo horn scales. It also has the customer's initials and custom blade etching with a bear paw. Now, I'm going to try to show the majority of the build on this video. I'm going to start off with a knife blank that we had cut out based on my design from a water jet company. And I had a few of these made. The heart of any knife making project is really grinding the bevels. Now, I grind the bevels using a tilt table attached to my 2x72 grinder. It's a fairly straightforward process. I use a coarse grit. This is a 36 grit belt. You want to cool it in a quench bucket almost after each pass, otherwise it just gets too hot to hold or to touch. The tilt table is actually adjustable. I've got it set for the angle of the bevel that I want to achieve, based on how high I want that bevel to come up on the blade. The other thing I want to do in this video is just show you how many different steps there are to creating a finished blade. Take another look from a different angle. And creating the bevel in this fashion really doesn't take all that long. You establish the angle of the bevel using the tilt table, and then really you're just following along and grinding until you reach the scribed center lines or railroad track lines on the edge of the blade. And you do that consistently on both sides. So this is the knife blank. It's got the pinholes pre-drilled through it, and I also reamed those. It's got both rough bevels ground. So the next step is going to be to start working on the bolsters. Now this is actually my very first time using or trying to make stainless steel bolsters. All the bolsters I've done in the past have been out of brass, much easier to work with. It's a softer material. I started with 1/4 by 1 inch AEBL stainless, and then I now have a 9-inch disc grinder. This is an Origin blade maker, and I picked this up because I really wanted to improve the fit and finish of my blades. And I was told that one way, or one major way, would be to use a disc grinder rather than a belt sander to create nice flat surfaces on small items like these bolsters. So you use the flat of the disc grinder, and that sandpaper is attached directly to the disc, unlike a belt sander where the belt runs over the flat platen and you could get a little wiggle and a little wobble or a little flop. So both of these bolsters, flattening them in this manner, flattening in one direction, then turning and flattening or grinding them in the other direction, I should end up with perfectly flat bolsters or bolster stock that will match up very nicely with the flat stock of the blade. Now, in addition to grinding the flats, I also set the table on this disc grinder to 90 degrees, and I'm going to grind the back edge of both bolsters. That'll be the edge that attaches or mounts or matches up to the scales. The next step, I've already pre-drilled these to match the pinholes in the blade. I'm going to just scribe them. So I put a little Dicam blue. You can use a magic marker, it doesn't matter. I'm going to scribe very roughly the shape that I want the bolsters to be. And I'm going to grind these prior to attaching them to the knife. In the past with brass, I've always just kind of rough ground them, attached them to the knife, and then finished grinding away all the excess material. The stainless is a little bit harder to grind, so I wanted to remove some of the material before attaching these rough bolsters to the blade. So back over to the 2x72. My 2x72 is a OBM, 2 horsepower, variable speed. Again, I'm still using a rough grit belt, still with 36. I'm also then going to switch out, and this is a 10-inch large wheel, and I'm going to start to shape the very front edge of both bolsters. So I've got both bolsters pinned together, and I'm just holding them with a pair of pliers, quenching them frequently in the water. These small parts do get hot pretty quickly, and I'm just going to create a nice curve on the front edge of those bolsters. Now really, it's going to be impossible to polish the front edge of the bolster once you attach it to the knife. So not only do you want to grind the shape, whatever shape you want on that front edge of the bolster, but you also want to polish it. So after a couple of quick belt changes, going from the 36 to an 80, to a 120, and then eventually to a 240, 400, and an 800, so actually quite a few belt changes, you can get the front edge of the bolster not only shaped, but also polished. So this is now, I think, the 800 grit belt. And I'm just lightly polishing or lightly sanding, and then just visually checking to make sure all of the deeper scratch marks are gone. Now I just did a quick belt change here. This is now a felt belt, 2-inch felt belt on the 2x72 with polishing copy. And that's just a very, very quick, easy way of polishing up the front of those bolsters to a nice mirror finish. Alright, so now I've fast forwarded past the heat treating. I've covered heat treating on other videos. These blades were heat treated in a heat treating oven. They were plate quenched, and then they were with dry ice cool afterwards, and then they were both also tempered for 2 hours at 385 degrees. What I'm doing now is cleaning up, or doing the post-heat treat bevels. So the original bevels were done at a 36 grit. I'm now going to regrind those at an 80 and then also 120 grit. Again, it's very easy to go back. I never changed the angle on the tilt table, so I just remount that onto the 2x72 and very quickly go over and grind out all of those deeper grind marks from the 36 grit belt. And you could take this down to whatever grit you want. I'm not one that really polishes up the bevels to a mirror finish. I kind of like to see some of the grind lines. I usually take them down to a 120 or a 240 grit. Now I'm going to use a surface grinding attachment for the 2x72 just to clean up the blades a little bit post heat treating. And I just did this with 120 grit. You can go down as fine as you want, 240, 800. You could actually almost go to a mirror finish straight off the surface grinder if that's what you desired. But this is a nice matte finish with a 120. Now back to the 9-inch disc grinder, I had a change in plans kind of mid-build. I decided instead of having a flat 90-degree angle on the back of the bolsters, I would actually make dovetail bolsters. So I changed the angle of the table. It doesn't have to be exactly 45 degrees. It's whatever angle you want for the angle on the bolster that you're making. Just don't change the angle on the disc sander, until you've also ground the scales to the same angle so that they match perfectly. And I'm just carefully grinding an angle on the back side of each bolster. And you'll see in a minute that the handles or the scales will be also ground with the same angle, and they'll just kind of neatly fit together. So these are the bolsters, and that's the back side of the bolster where the bolster matches up with the scales. So here you see them just held in place with pins. They're not attached yet, they're not hammer peened. But you can see nice flat surface along the blade, so there shouldn't be any little gaps or grooves. Time to hammer peen the bolsters into place. Now I went with 1/8 inch holes, and then I also reamed them with a tapered ream, so that when you're hammer peening, the pin actually swells up and fills in that void and actually creates a mechanical bond that holds the bolster in place. No glue at all, no epoxy, and if done correctly, once you grind away some of the surface of the pins and the bolsters, you should hardly see the pins at all. Now, I've seen people use 400 series pins. I decided to use 300 series. They're a little bit softer, a little bit more malleable, but my reasoning was really because 300 series stainless won't rust, whereas 400 would. So these are the bolsters, dovetail bolsters because of the angle on the back, and they are hammer peened in place. Now the scale material I'm going to use on this is a water buffalo horn. These are readily available on the internet. It's kind of a neat material to work with. They cut like wood, and they grind nice and easy, and more importantly, they polish up pretty easily. A little bit easier to polish than some of the plastics. They're available overseas, and they're also available in the United States. I've tried some of the dyed buffalo horn, and I've tried it in red, and all of the dye comes off when you're grinding. So you always end up with, or I always end up with, the same brown or shades of brown, which I'm fine with. Just, if you're expecting it to be red and it doesn't end up red, it's a little disappointing at the time. These were always planned to be brown. So this is the scales with that angled ground end fitting nice inside that dovetail bolster. And the way I mount my scales, as always, is with the Northgard method. So I'm going to glue one side in place, then I will drill the holes after that glue dries. Then I will cut off whatever excess material is on that scale, and then I'll repeat the process on the other side. I'll glue the second half on. Once the glue is dried, then I'll drill the pinholes right through, one scale, the blank, and the other scale. And it's just a way of attaching the scales exactly where you want them to be, gluing them in place before you drill the pinholes. And the pinholes, doing it in this fashion, get drilled straight through all three pieces, the final pass. So you end up with, unless you really screw up, you end up with perfectly aligned pinholes, no gaps. So I'm gluing with a 2-ton, 2-part epoxy, both halves, the blank as well as the side of the scale that's going to match to the blank. I'm going to push that handle material as far forward as possible so that there's no gaps. It's a nice tight seam, and then I'm going to clamp everything in place, and I'm going to recheck and recheck and recheck to make sure that that's pushed all the way up. I'm going to clean off whatever excess glue is on the blade just with a little alcohol before it dries. After that handle material dries into place, I take off the clamps, and I just use a pin saw to cut off the excess material. You could use a bandsaw, whatever you want. And this is really the first indication of what the final project is going to end up looking like. The scales are still too thick. I still have to add the other side, but we're going to jump forward a little bit. So now I've got the other side of the scales glued in place. I'm going to, and I've already let that glue dry, and I've cut off the excess material with the pin saw. Now I'm going back to the 2x72, and I'm just going to profile those scales to match the profile of the blank. And this is a pretty easy process. I use a 90-degree table, so I'm working off the flats on both handles. And you can always let a coarse grit belt run over on one side. So this belt, if you take a close look on the platen, is off to the right of the screen. It's overhanging. And that overhang allows you to work the curve a little bit, to get an inside curve. Now, it's not perfect. I'll go back over these with a small wheel, but it's really nice for roughing out the profiles. So now I'm going to go to a small wheel attachment on the Oregon Blade Maker 2x72. This is also an OBM small wheel attachment. Comes with a variety of different diameters and really nice as far as grinding those inside curves, getting them nice and smooth, and getting rid of all of the horizontal grind lines from rough grinding these things to shape, or rough profiling them. So now both sides, the handles are attached. I'm getting rid of some of those horizontal grind lines on the flat platen. And by now, I mean, we're 16 or 17 minutes into this video, but you can see just how many steps are involved in putting a knife like this together. Now, this is not a simple knife because of the bolsters. It'd be much easier to just have scales without bolsters. But none of these steps in themselves is very difficult. It's just, you just have to keep walking in the right direction. So now what I'm doing is I'm back on the flat platen with a coarse grit belt back to the 36, and I'm just grinding each side of the handles flat and thinning them out so that they match up with the thickness of the bolster. So at the same time, I'm also going to be grinding that top edge of the bolster and the pins. So you can see here, one side is not done. The pins are protruding, the bolster's protruding, the hammer peened pins are protruding, and on this side, everything is now flat. And you can no longer see the bolster pins. I'll do that to both sides. I'll also use a finer grit belt and start to polish those bolsters and the handles, right on the 2x72. And I'll also start to shape the scales as well as the bolsters. Be very careful you don't hit the finished blade with the sanding belt. You can ruin a knife very, very easily. And actually, this belt is actually that felt belt that we used before. So after I shaped the knife, I actually started to polish it right on the 2x72. The final steps of polishing are on a buffing wheel, and the way that I do it's probably not the most efficient. I usually sand down to maybe a 1500 grit, almost a 2000 grit at times. Then I will buff on the felt belt on the 2x72, then I'll polish on the buffing wheel. But a lot of times I'll still find some small scratches and small imperfections, and then I'll just go back and hand sand those areas and then repolish. So the way I do my knives, I end up repolishing, at least 2, sometimes 3 times to get the desired results that I like. Now, I'm not going to cover the whole sharpening on this particular video. I've covered sharpening knives on a 2x72 many times. I think I actually have a full video on it. But basically, I do the entire sharpening on the 2x72. To establish that micro bevel, I use a 120 grit belt. Then I will go on to a 240, a 400, an 800, a 1500, and a 2000. And each time I repolish that micro bevel, I'm pushing the burr in the opposite direction. So I create a burr on one side of the micro bevel, then I flip the knife around and turn that burr back in the other direction, then change belts to a finer grit belt, and do the same thing over and over. And I do that all the way down to a 2000 grit belt. And I found by doing it this way, the most time it works best for me. It's just a very quick way of doing it, except for the multiple belt changes. The final step in the process is to use a leather stropping belt. I don't use it under power. I just mount it on the 2x72, and then I just stroke each side. Again, just polishing or flipping whatever tiny little micro burr is still left. And the end result of doing it this way, if you do it correctly, should be a razor sharp knife. So this is basically the finished knife. You can see the dovetail bolsters fitting perfectly against the scales. The blade is definitely sharp. I'm going to ship this down to my friend Tommy Berg, and he will make a custom sheath for it, and it will be off to the customer. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. By all means, please leave me some comments so I know what you like, what you don't like. I'd like to give you an invite to join us on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. You can also check out some of the knife blanks we have available at DIYEasyCrafts.com. And if you'd like to take a look at some of the knives that I make, those can be found on Berg, which is B-E-R-G, knifemaking.com. Lastly, as many of you know, Jason Northgard and I just finished a book called Introduction to Knife Making, the Beginner's DIY Guide to Making Knives. And that you can find on Amazon.com. Thank you very much.